When will the world end? I remember when I was about in the 5th or 6th grade, someone saying that the world was going to end on that very day. Well, I didn't quite believe it, but I admit I was a little nervous all day long. Well, when will the world end, and can we know when it will end? Today's lesson is entitled, Predicting the End of the World. Stay tuned.
The Churches of Christ of the North Texas area present The Truth in Love.
How precious is the book divine by inspiration give. Bright as a lamp its precepts shine to guide my soul to heaven. Holy Bible, book divine, precious treasure thou art mine. Lamp to my feet and a light to my way, to guide me safely home. It sweetly cheers my drooping heart in this dark vale of tears. Light my life it still imparts and quells my rising fears. Holy Bible, book divine, precious treasure thou art mine. Lamp to my feet and a light to my way, to guide me safely home.
Welcome to our program. I'm your host, David Roper. I preach for the Brown Trail Church of Christ, which is in Fort Worth, Texas. But today I'm on the campus of Oklahoma Christian College for a very special program. Our program today is being brought to you by Stafford North, who is the Executive Vice President of Oklahoma Christian College. Now, right at the moment, I'm outside the Student Center, which also houses the cafeteria, where I've eaten many meals with my 3 girls who went to school here. We're happy to bring you today part 2 of Stafford North's lesson on predicting the end of the world. Mr. North has served the college here for 35 years. He serves the College Church of Christ as elder. He's preached throughout this area. We're happy to have him with us again for part 2 right after this song.
The spacious firmament on high, with all the blue ethereal sky, and spangled heavens a shining frame, their great original proclaim. The unwearied sun from day to day does his creator's power display, and publishes to every land the work of an almighty hand. What though in solemn silence all move round this dark terrestrial ball? What though no real voice nor sound amid their radiant orbs be found? In reason's ear they all rejoice, and utter forth a glorious voice, forever singing as they shine. The hand that made us is divine.
We're glad to have you with us today and to continue our discussion begun last week on the question of predicting the end of the world. Is it possible for us to predict when the world is going to come to an end? There are people going about and speaking to us about that subject and thinking they can. Some predict the exact day. Others predict maybe the decade in which it will take place. Others say, I can only predict that those who are alive now will see the end of the world coming. We know that people have been making such predictions for a long, long time, and many of them, of course, have not come to pass. The question then is, did the Lord intend for us to make such predictions? Does He want us to be able to predict when the end of the world is coming? And has He given us the signs by which we can do that? And that's the basis of our study today. We're looking at Matthew chapter 24. This is the passage to which most people go when they think of predicting the end of the world. It's that passage, you know, that has the signs to which some point by talking about wars and rumors of wars and pestilence and earthquakes and all of these things. Are those signs by which we can predict about when the end of the world is going to be? Well, we studied that last time, but we're going to take a brief review of it and pick up then our more detailed study about the middle of the chapter. I hope you'll have your Bibles open as we begin now our study of Matthew chapter 24. The first heading that we're going to look at in this study is the occasion. We talked of that last time. Why did Jesus say what He said about the coming events? He had been talking about the scribes and Pharisees, and He called them hypocrites. He had been standing in the area around the temple as He made that address. He said, "Your fathers had killed the prophets, and now you are going to be like them. You are going to kill prophets." And of course, He knew they were about to kill the greatest of the prophets, Jesus Himself. And He says, "So upon you is going to come all of these things that have been in store and have been heaped up for a long, long time. And so upon you is going to come this, upon this generation," He says in the 36th verse of Matthew 23. And then on down the last verse or two of the chapter, He says, "Your house is left unto you desolate," talking to these very people. Now, when His disciples heard Him say that, they pointed out the buildings of the temple, and they said, "Why, Lord, look at the buildings of the temple. Don't you see how beautiful they are?" And Jesus said to them, "Wait just a minute, I want to tell you, the time's coming when not one stone upon another shall be left that will not be thrown down." And that really shocked them, and that was sort of the end of that discussion. Then, that's the end of the occasion, part one. They walked down the Kidron Valley, up on the other side to the Mount of Olives, and there they sit down and look back on all the temple grounds and all the city of Jerusalem. And then we come in Matthew chapter 24, and beginning in verse 3, to the question that they ask. Based on what is said before, they now have Jesus alone in private, and so they come to Him with a question. And the question basically is, as recorded by Matthew chapter 24, and Luke chapter 21, and Mark chapter 13, "Lord, when are these things going to happen you've been telling us about? And what are the signs by which we'll know they're about to happen?" They spoke of it as the end of the world, because in their minds this destruction must be the end of the world. But really they're wanting to know, "Lord, when will this city be destroyed? When will this temple be destroyed that you've talked about? And what are the signs by which we'll know it's about to happen?" In their mind, they're talking principally about the coming destruction that Jesus already has predicted. And that was the question that they asked. Then we come to the third division of this study, and that is beginning in verse 4 down through verse 14 of chapter 24, the preliminary and possibly misleading signs. That is, Jesus has said to them, "Look, I know that I'm shocking you by what I'm about to say. I know that it's going to be hard for you to understand that this city and this temple will be destroyed. And when I tell you that, and when I tell you it will happen in your lifetime, as He does in verse 34 of chapter 24, all these things shall happen to this generation," He says. The very people living right now will see these events take place. And so having said that, Jesus said in His own mind, now every time they hear about a war, they're going to think this is it. Every time they hear about a rumor of war, they're going to think this is it. Every time they hear of persecution, they're going to think this is it. Every time they see a pestilence or an earthquake, they're going to think this is it. I want to caution them not to jump too quickly when they see these ordinary occurrences of life taking place. And so He says, don't be fooled. When you hear of a war, that's not it. When you hear a rumor of war, that's not it. When you hear of an earthquake or a pestilence or famine or persecution, or you hear of false Christ coming and all these things, that's not the way you can tell that this terrible destruction of Jerusalem that I've mentioned to you that will happen in your lifetime, that's not how you tell it's going to take place. Those things might fool you. They will be going on. In fact, the gospel will be preached in the whole world first. And Colossians chapter 1 verse 23 tells us that even in the lifetime of Paul, before the destruction of Jerusalem, this had taken place, the preaching of the gospel in the whole world. These then are things that might mislead them. They would live in constant fear. Jesus doesn't want that to happen. So he comes down to verse 15 and the fourth division of our study and says, I now want to give you the real sign. The real sign is when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem. In Matthew 24, he calls that the abomination of desolation. That was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and Daniel meant an army that was coming to destroy the city, but he used figurative language. But over in Luke's account of this very same thing we read in Matthew 24, in Luke 21, verse 20, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So we know those two are parallel, and that's what Jesus is talking about. When you see armies coming to destroy Jerusalem, like the Roman armies did in 70 A.D., then you will know that's the real sign. Now's the time to make your move. Now's the time to do something. Not back here when we had wars that you heard of, or rumors of wars, or you heard of pestilence or earthquake or famines. That's not the time to do anything, he says. But the time to do something is when you see the army coming to surround Jerusalem. And when you see that, now's the time to make your move. That's the real sign. Now the fifth division is, what are you to do when you see the real sign? What are you supposed to do when that real sign comes? Well, here's what you're supposed to do, Jesus says. You run to the hills of Judea, and you go so quickly you don't even go back to your house to pack a bag. The ones on the housetop don't come down and go in the house. The one that's in the field, don't go back to the house and pack. And hope that this terrible destruction, this coming army surrounding Jerusalem, doesn't come in winter. Hope you don't have small children. Then it'll be hard to travel. It'll be much more difficult for you if that happens. If this destruction comes at a time when you're subject to those difficulties. Now that would have nothing to do with the end of the world, of course, because it will matter none whether the end of the world comes in winter or not, or on the Sabbath day or not, or whether you have small children or not. But it would matter greatly if you were trying to leave the city of Jerusalem as quickly as you can. I've had 4 small children. And I want to tell you, when it comes time to travel in a hurry, it's a lot harder when you got 4 small children than if you don't. So it applies very well to this matter of traveling with the children, but it doesn't have anything to do with the end of the world. Now, we come to the next section. We've already talked about what to do when the real sign comes, number 6, and now we're starting some new territory from what we covered in the last lesson. The nature of the coming event. Jesus tells us what this event is going to be like. Matthew 24, verses 21 through 28. And here he says, for then in those days there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall be. And he goes on to say that there will come people who are claiming to be false Christ, and don't let them lead you astray. I've told you in advance about them. It's going to be terrible days. Terrible, terrible times with deceivers coming. And so he warns them, when this army surrounds Jerusalem and closes the net around the city, it'll be terrible. It just will be awful. And we read the account of that in Josephus, and it was a terrible time. People starved to death. They couldn't find anything to eat. Mothers ate their own children. It was absolutely terrible. As terrible a time as ever has been in the world, just as Jesus said it would be. And that entirely fulfills his prediction about the nature of the coming event. This event about the fall of Jerusalem was going to be terrible. And there would be those who would come and say, I'll tell you how to get out of this. He said, don't believe these false Christs when they come, because they really are not true Christ. They aren't true Messiahs or true believers. When the Son of Man comes, it's evident. So if it isn't evident like lightning, you'll know they're false. And certainly those who came and said they would lead them out of the trap of the Romans were false. Jesus said, where the eagles gather, that's where the carcass is. That is, the Roman system had become outdated. It had become outmoded. Its time was over. And so God spelled the end of it with the fall of the city of Jerusalem. Now we come to number 7, and that is the striking events to follow immediately, verses 29 through 31. Striking events to follow immediately. Right after the fall of Jerusalem, he says these striking events will happen. Now we're still before verse 34. And in that verse he says all these things, everything before verse 34 will happen to this generation. So we're still before verse 34, and these things are those that will happen during the first generation, or the times of that generation, during the first century, and they happened then. And understanding that, we can know what they're talking about. These are figurative expressions that might mislead us, so we have to look at them very carefully. He says the sun and the moon and the stars are darkened. Oh, somebody says that's got to be the end of the world. But wait. In Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10, the very same thing was used, the very same expressions were used to apply to the fall of Babylon. In Ezekiel chapter 32 and verse 7, the same expressions are used with the fall of Pharaoh of Egypt. In Joel chapter 2, verses 30 and 31, the very same expressions were used to talk about the end of the Jewish age and the beginning of the gospel age. So these things are not said of the end of the world. They're symbolic expressions that simply mean a great event is about to occur, usually connected with the fall of a nation, the sun being darkened, and the moon not giving her light, and the stars falling out of heaven. Those are symbolic things to say a great and notable time is about to occur. Now, these are the things that we could outline. Each of these also applies to the fall of Jerusalem, and they were to happen immediately thereafter. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven. It doesn't say the Son of Man shall appear, it just says His sign shall appear. That is, He predicted the fall of Jerusalem, and when that happens, this was a sign of the Son of Man who would still be in heaven. The tribes of the earth shall mourn, the Jewish tribes shall mourn, scattered all over the earth, shall mourn the fall of the city of Jerusalem. They shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. Jesus talked about how He would come in the clouds. And so Jesus, in a sense, came when He destroyed Jerusalem. He came symbolically. He said, I'm going to do this. And so when it happened, in a figurative way, He came to do it. Isaiah chapter 19 and verse 1 says Jehovah is coming on a cloud to destroy Egypt. Matthew 16:28 says that some would see Jesus coming in His kingdom. Matthew 26:64 talks about Jesus sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven, coming and sitting at the same time. Obviously, He's using symbolic language here, but whenever Jesus predicts that something will happen, and then that event takes place through the power of some agent He uses, Jesus may be said in a figurative way to come and do it. And so that's what He's talking about here. And then He says, angels or messengers will gather the elect from all over the earth. That is, I'm going to send out people, preachers of the gospel, to preach the message. They are messengers, they are angels of light that will come and bring all of these people to an understanding of the knowledge of the Word of God. And once the Jewish system was gone, and the Jewish people could no longer stand in the way of the spread of the gospel, then these preachers were able to move more freely and do more things in bringing people to the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Now we come to the 8th section of our study, chapter 24, verses 32 through 35. Here's that section that deals with the verse in which Jesus says, all these things shall happen to this generation. The parable of the fig tree simply means that when you see a fig tree put out leaves, that's a sign to you that things are about to take place that you can predict. You know the fruit won't be far behind. And Jesus says, I'm telling you these things ahead of time so you'll know how to understand that as these things begin to happen, the armies surround Jerusalem and so on, you'll remember that I said all this, and you'll remember that I have told you the truth. And then He says, it will all happen to the people who are living during the time that I have been speaking this. And so we close that 8th section. And we also close the portion that deals with the fall of Jerusalem. We now start the 9th section in verse 36, where Jesus says, but of that day and hour. But of that day and hour. Very important for us to understand the change in tone that takes place here. He introduces it with a conjunction, but, and then He says, of that day. Remember, Jesus talked in Matthew 7, many will say to me, in that day. He uses that as an expression for the final coming, the judgment day. And so He does here. But of that day, He says, I have some different things to tell you. I've been telling you about the fall of Jerusalem, but now I have some things to tell you about some other subject. And now He's going to introduce the coming of the end of the world. And He says, but of that day. And note the contrast that He gives. He starts here to talk about that day and hour, and see what He says about it. Verse 37, verse 36, nobody knows of that day except Jesus. Jesus knew when the fall of Jerusalem would come and predicted it and said it'll happen during your lifetime, and it'll happen when the Roman army comes and surrounds you and does it to you. But of that day, the end of the world, Jesus says, I don't know when that'll be. Notice the contrast. I can't even tell you when that will be. Even the angels, nobody but God Himself knows when that event will take place. Then going down to verse 37, He says, for the coming of the Son of Man shall be just like the days of Noah. What happened in the days of Noah? Life went on as usual. Normal days took place until the day that Noah entered into the ark. They were marrying and giving in marriage and eating and drinking. Everything was as usual, life as usual, until Noah entered the ark, closed the door, and then the rains came, and it was too late for anybody to change. Now, Jesus had said there will be abnormal days before the fall of Jerusalem. You'll see that army coming. It's going to be abnormal days. But at the end of the world, it'll be life as usual. No signs to predict it, no way to tell. All of a sudden, the end comes. It's not predictable, and it will come upon us suddenly, and normal days will precede it. Then we read on down in verse 40. There shall be 2 men in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. There's no signs to tell you. Life will be going on, and all of a sudden, one will be acceptable to God, and he'll go one way. One will be unacceptable to God, and he'll go the other. No signs to warn, no way to tell. You can't run from it. All of a sudden, these people are there, and here they are out together, and suddenly they're separated because God has chosen to change to send each one to his own place, and so there will be no running from it. There'll be no signs to tell you. Normal days precede one, abnormal the other. Jesus knew one, He didn't know the other. The two are set in terrific contrast to each other. And that brings us then to the 10th section of our study, which is, watch ye therefore, verse 42, through the end of chapter 25, all the way to the end of chapter 24 and the end of chapter 25, this section. And the theme of that is, watch therefore, for you know not the day nor the hour. Jesus says, I want to tell you, you can't know when this end is coming. There are no signs to predict it. It may come at any moment. The real lesson here is, I want you to watch and be ready for the time when it comes. Now let's look at the verses that deal with that, starting in verse 42. Chapter 24, verse 42. Therefore be on the alert. Watch, therefore, for you do not know what day your Lord is coming. Some say, well, I don't know the day, but I know the decade. Oh no. He means by this, you don't have any idea when He's coming. You don't have the slightest idea when He's coming. Jesus didn't even know. How could we expect to know? But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you be ready too, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think He will. Even those who are His servants, even those who are the servants of God Himself, will not know when the Master is coming. So we don't predict. God doesn't want us to predict. Jesus doesn't give us signs by which we can predict. The point is, we must be ready at any moment. If we knew when He was coming, then we wouldn't have to be good and ready until that time. People could reason that way. He doesn't want us doing that. He wants us to live as if the moment might come at any time. And people in 1000 AD were supposed to do that, and people in 1500 AD are supposed to do that, and people in 2000 AD are supposed to do that. Whenever we live, we're to live as though the time could come upon us at any moment. Then when we come on to chapter 25, Jesus talks about parables relating to the final judgment day, and finally closes chapter 25 with that great story about the judgment where all are gathered before the Master, and they're separated as between sheep and goats. And there He says that we are to remember that we are to be ready for that time to come. And the Lord will say to those on one hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you. And to the others He'll say, depart, because I don't know you. And so all of this, chapter 24, leads right up into chapter 25 and this study of the things that we see relating to the end of the world. So remember, verse 34 is the line of demarcation. It's the line that separates the discussion of the end of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem, from the discussion of the end of the world. The two are not parallel. They're not alike. In fact, they're made opposite to each other. So that we have, on the one hand, nobody knowing when the end of the world takes place, but you can know when the fall of Jerusalem will be. You have no way of knowing when the time, you have no way of doing anything about the end of the world. You can't run from it. There are no signs. But we do know that there are signs for the fall of Jerusalem. So the two are shown to be separate from each other. The main lesson we need to learn is not to predict, but to say, be ready when the time comes.
The spacious firmament on high, with all the blue ethereal sky, and spangled heavens a shining frame, their great original proclaim. The unwearied sun from day to day does his creators power display, and publishes to every land the work of an almighty hand. What though in solemn silence all move round his dark terrestrial ball? What though no real voice nor sound amid their radiant orbs be found? In reason's ear they all rejoice, and utter forth a glorious voice, forever singing as they shine. The hand that made us is divine.
Our thanks to Stafford North for that excellent presentation. I know that you'll want this on audio cassette so that you can hear it again and so you can share it with a friend. Just send us your name and address. We'll be happy to send you an audio cassette absolutely free. Now, offers like this are made possible because of the generous contributions by individuals and congregations who believe in what we're trying to do. One such congregation is the Highland Church of Christ that meets in Fort Worth, Texas. The Highland Church of Christ meets at 6262 South Freeway in Fort Worth. Their Sunday morning worship service is at 9:30 a.m. They'd love to have you visit at any time. Next week, we'll be back here in the Oklahoma City area for a message by an Oklahoma City preacher. We hope you can be with us at that time.
This has been The Truth in Love, sponsored by the Churches of Christ of the North Texas area. For a copy of today's program, additional information, or Bible correspondence course at no charge to you, please write The Truth in Love, Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. Once again, write The Truth in Love, Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. We invite you to attend the Church of Christ in your area. Join us again next Sunday at the same time for The Truth in Love.